was a straight up down. Listen, might as well call the guy Attila the Hun, because this dude took everybody to the meatpacking district. If you know what I mean. Actually, I don't even know what I mean.
But it's provocative.
No, it's not. It's
Gets
gross.
the people going.
You have to understand that Attila the Hun was a Thanos extinction level threat to the Roman Empire, and he basically slapped Rome around like. And all the proof you need for that is in the nickname the Romans gave Attila, Flagellum Dei, which literally translates to the Scourge of God, or in modern English simply translates to
Dog.
But is it true that Attila was a real-life evil RPG playthrough, or is history doing the man wrong? Was Attila really the most evil man in history like many claim, or was he a victim of the good old saying, if you conquer from west to east, you're great, but if you do the same from east to west, you're a barbarian? Yes, Attila was a conqueror and killed countless people while taking lands that these people weren't exactly willing to part with, but that kind of comes with the whole conqueror thing in general, and the Romans played that game as well as anybody, as did Alexander the Great, as did Napoleon Bonaparte, but somehow Attila and Genghis Khan always get the worst rep of all these conquerors, and their Eastern origin most certainly plays a role in that.
I hate foreigners. I hate foreigners.
But with that out of the way, let's take an objective look at Attila's achievements, which, no matter whether in the service of evil or good, are impressive. Attila was the sole man in charge of building an empire that rivaled the Romans in size and absolutely dominated their territory for 20 years. But before all that, like all stories, Attila's story starts with a woman realizing,
I'm pregnant, you little bitch!
The name of the pregnant woman in question is lost to the times, but it might have been Ernak, and her impregnator in question was Munzuk, who in fact put 2 babies in his wife's oven, one in 400 CE and the other one sometime later in 406 CE. The older was named Bleda, and the younger one would become known as Attila. At the time, Munzuk's father Uldin was the leader of the Huns, who were a nomadic people whose origin is kind of disputed. We think they might be descendants of somewhere in China, but we're not sure. They did, however, definitely fight against the Chinese at some point, lost, and said, screw it, these Chinese might be onto something with this whole journey to the west thing, so let's journey westward. Which way is it? That's westward. And so westward the Huns went, but not on some Buddhist peace thing. No, they journeyed west in search of blood. To the Western world, these Huns kind of just appeared out of nowhere, riding their trademark horses and spreading terror in every region they passed through. And by terror, I mean murdering and raiding and otherwise R-wording everybody they came across. But again, this version of the Huns were just a bunch of horse-riding, murder-loving, like-minded nomadic tribes doing their thing. They were far from united. That unity would only be achieved after Uldin's death, when his sons Ruga and Oktar took over, aka Attila's uncles, and Attila's dad, the third brother Munzuk, was kind of like the third member of Destiny's Child. Nice to be a part of the gang, but nobody cares. So with the brothers Ruga and Oktar running the show, slowly but surely, they made these scattered nomadic tribes see that they are actually all operating under the same model. And tribes that reap together stay together. So now the newly unified Huns horse shared on their way to reaping and absolutely annihilating the entire West. The Goths fell to the Huns, the Vandals got, the Franks got stormed, the Lombards, the Anglo-Saxons, and of course also the Alans, because what do you expect from a bunch of Alans? And even other peoples were sent packing, and being sent packing meant going anywhere that's as far away from the Huns as possible, aka going further west, and it just so happened that further west was nothing but the territory of Rome. And mind you that the Romans had done their fair share of warring and slaughtering of all of these people themselves, so many amongst them, like the Goths, had become sworn enemies to Rome, meaning when these Goths came knocking on the Romans' door asking for refuge and help, the Romans were like,
Well. How the turntables...
But the Romans let the Goths into their lands and, in return, imposed all kinds of restrictions on them. Taxation, humiliation, all of that. Basically, they used the Goths as cheap labor, cheap military, or cheap otherwise. So eventually the Goths were like, you Romans are so cheap, it almost feels like this is instant gaming. I don't know if that was a smooth transition or just straight up terrible. I just know that instant gaming is the good kind of cheap, because they constantly have discounts on all video games. Black Myth Wukong, God of War Ragnarok, the new Zelda.
It doesn't matter!
PlayStation, Xbox, PC, Nintendo.
It doesn't matter!
Because instant gaming has games for it and they have them cheaper. So go on ahead and check the price for whichever game you want anywhere on the web. Then check the price on instant gaming. No, seriously, do it. Check the price. Go ahead and do it. The point is, all games are cheaper on instant gaming. Code only, no physical copy, but that's essentially the same as downloading from the PlayStation Store or Steam or any store. It's all legal on instant gaming. It's all original on instant gaming. There's no resets, there's no use, there's no cracking, there's none of that. And when it seems too good to be true, it is actually the link in my description, so click that or you'll get slaughtered like the Goths were by the Huns, until they escaped into Roman borders, where at least they weren't dying to violence anymore, but ended up living like dogs. Restrictions, taxation, humiliation. It wasn't long before the Goths decided to bite the hand that was barely feeding them, and soon the Romans had a conflict within their own territory on their hands, fighting off the refugee crises that became the Goths. This obviously seriously weakened Rome, who already had an empire that stretched as far as Asia and Africa, and those borders were bordering nations that weren't exactly on board with Rome's conquest. So the Romans couldn't afford the Goth refugee crisis escalating into a civil war, not when the Roman Empire was already stretched so thin that Rome had to establish 2 seats of power, 2 emperors, 2 capitals, dividing into the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire, which later became known as the Byzantine Empire. You have to understand all this to know how troubling this Goth refugee crisis was for Rome, especially knowing that there's an undefeated army of violent Huns blitzing every battle with their cavalry and barreling down on Rome. So the Hunnic invasion was already a major problem for Rome before a single Roman soldier even crossed blades with a Hun warrior. Luckily for Rome, Ruga, who had since taken sole control of the Huns after his brother Octar died in 430 CE, Ruga had his sights set on Persia first, and so the Huns rode their horses all the way to Persia, and they got whooped. The Huns versus Persia, that whole battle, it wasn't even close. Yeah, surprise. If you don't come at Persia like this, forget about it. The Huns' road trip to Persia did, however, give Rome enough time to come up with a plan. In light of the refugee crisis and the large empire Rome had to control with enemies and rebellions everywhere, they decided that the best course of action was to use the Huns and their warrior ways to their advantage. The Romans hired the Hunnic warriors as mercenaries to fight any battle that Rome couldn't attend to. It was actually genius, and it worked so well that the Roman civilization kind of celebrated the Huns for a time, calling them the terror of the barbarians and the support of the Republic. Oh, and you should know that barbarians to the Romans is basically anyone that isn't Roman. So with that uneasy peace with the Huns established, things stayed quiet for a while until the Hun leader Ruga died in 434 CE. And since Ruga was shooting blanks all his life, the third brother, Munzuk, suddenly shot into relevancy. You see, Munzuk had two sons, Ruga's nephews, who were now the rightful heirs to the throne, and their names were Bleda and Attila. The two brothers now took over in 434 CE, and being bred into leadership in an ever more powerful Hunnic empire that lived for battle and bloodshed, the brothers knew nothing but warfare and were the perfect warlords that took the Huns to new heights. Side note that the brothers' power dynamic as co-rulers was never quite clear, but Bleda died in 455 CE anyway, so it didn't even matter all that much. And it's also not clear how Bleda died, but that violent brother of his, who had a lot to gain by his demise, seems like a solid candidate for cause of death. So Attila was in charge of the Huns, and thanks to the writings of Roman diplomat Priscus of Panium, we know a little of how to imagine Attila. He described the leader of the Huns as he was haughty in his walk, rolling his eyes hither and thither, so that the power of his proud spirit appeared in the movement of his body. He was indeed a lover of war, yet restrained in action, mighty in counsel, gracious to supplicants, and lenient to those who were once received into his protection. He was short of stature, with a broad chest and a large head. His eyes were small, his beard thin and sprinkled with gray, and he had a flat nose and a swarthy complexion, showing the evidences of his origin. And though his temper was such that he always had great self-confidence, yet his assurance was increased by finding the sword of Mars, always esteemed sacred. So this guy was now in charge, and Attila had Rome by the balls so bad that this foreigner casually claimed he was a demigod wielding the sword of the Roman god of war Mars, and no Roman said a damn thing about this. This obvious blasphemy, the Romans were just like, okay. They were terrified of Attila, and all they wanted was to stay on Attila's good side, and like every bully knows, a scared victim is a gift that keeps on giving. Attila figured that since Rome is so damn scared of him and his army, he might as well just threaten them to pay him more or he'll stop playing mercenary for them. And it worked. Rome was stretched so thin and so in need of the Huns as mercenaries, so desperate to be cool with them, that they agreed to whatever tribute Attila came up with. So Attila increased the yearly gold tribute to 60 kilograms of gold, and then later, in 435, he increased it some more to 115 kilograms of gold, and because Attila was not the kind of guy that is satisfied once you give him a finger, but actually wants you to give him the whole thing, that came out wrong. That came out entirely wrong. Since Attila is a daredevil, Attila was like, wait, aren't there technically two Roman empires now? And he made Rome sign another treaty for more gold, because two empires. But you have to understand that Attila was not after the gold for his personal gain or vanity, no. In fact, Attila refused luxury and adornments, while others in his camp drank from golden cups. Attila drank from a wooden cup and always kept things simple and quiet. He just cared about his war, and all Rome's gold was a way to finance that war, those campaigns which allowed him and his Huns to terrorize every other European nation, everything from the Balkans to Greece, about 70 cities, killing hundreds of thousands in the process. The Huns absolutely dominated Europe until they grew their own empire to a size that rivaled Rome. And at this point, the Romans were like, he's gonna make us give him more lunch money again, isn't he? And the answer was, yeah, another treaty, more money for the Huns. It was. At some point, Rome was paying a yearly tribute of 700 kilograms of gold, But of course, Rome is not just some forever victim. There was a reason they are considered the greatest empire ever, and as they were paying off their bully, they were actually just biding time to assemble an army that could actually make a stand against Attila and the Huns, because they knew it was just a matter of time until Attila would amass enough power to attack and take down Rome itself. And actually, it turns out that that matter of time was also a matter of the heart. The thing that finally made Attila attack the Roman Empire to strike Rome itself was love.
Baby, don't hurt me no more.
The year is 450 CE, and the current emperor of Rome is Valentinian III, and ever the romantic, he wanted to force his daughter Honoria into a political marriage with some disgusting dude that she wanted no part of. And since Attila had the reputation of wielding the sword of Mars, Honoria could only imagine what other godly parts he was wielding, and she wrote a love letter to this dreamy, exotic bad boy. A love letter in which she pled to him to come save her from this unwanted marriage, rescue her, and take her hand. And Attila, ever the white knight in bloody armor, did come to her aid, sacked Rome for a woman in need that he'd never even met, and once he saved Honoria from her father, him and her ruled Rome side by side, happily ever after, which is why we now, to this day, speak of the term honor when a man is loyal and dedicated to his wife, just like how Attila was to Honoria. Of course not. Of course that didn't happen. Be ashamed of yourself if you believe that. You consume too much Hollywood. The truth is that, yes, Honoria did send a letter to Attila out of spite for the marriage that she didn't want. That's real. But outside of it being some plea for help, the exact contents of that letter are unknown, except that she included her engagement ring in the letter. Attila, though, interpreted the letter's contents as a marriage offer, aka an offer to be the new owner of the Roman Empire, aka a good enough excuse to attack Rome under the pretense of love and just taking what is now rightfully his. Basically, Attila felt like Rome was his wedding gift. So to collect that wedding gift, Attila brought over 200,000 guests and came knocking on Rome's door like the big bad wolf he was, huffing and puffing, leaving the little scared Roman piggies with no choice but to cry for help. And guess who they turned to? The Romans turned to their enemy turned refugee. They turned to the Goths. Now, the Goths were the enemy of my enemy, who was my enemy turned refugee, turned enemy, no longer enemy. I don't know. Anyway, the Goths agreed because A, it was a way to improve their situation within Roman territory and it gave them leverage, and B, if they didn't fight alongside the Romans against the Huns now, Attila and his army would later just come after them on their way to take over everything. Rome didn't just ask the Goths, though. You have to understand that Attila was a Thanos-level threat, so the Roman Empire officially appointed General Flavius Aetius as Captain Rome, and Rome managed to convince everybody else to stand with Rome and the Goths against the Huns, the Franks, the Saxons, the Burgundians, even the Alans. They all rallied to Captain Rome's side to become the Roman Avengers in the Battle of Europe, like
Avengers!
Assemble.
In fact, Captain Rome, Flavius Aetius, had once actually fought alongside the Huns, back when the Romans hired them as mercenaries, you remember? So Aetius, Captain Rome, he was familiar with their ferocity, a familiarity that probably only inspired fear when he led the Roman Avengers into battle against Thanos the Hun on June 20th in 451 AD. A battle that went down as one of history's bloodiest military conflicts at that point, a battle in which the bodies just piled up in the thousands like... But in the end, after Rome finally got all of its brothers to whoop Attila after school with class, they finally defeated the mighty Hun. Attila lost and retreated to his camp, and the Goths were ready to go after him and completely annihilate Attila and eradicate the Huns entirely, but Captain Rome convinced them not to do that, but to return home and lick their wounds rather than rush into enemy territory hastily. This was less Aetius being considerate for the lives of the Visigoths or the Huns. He was planning ahead. He knew that Rome was currently weakened, in need of allies, and as long as there was a common enemy in the Huns, the other tribes, like the Goths, would seek to remain allies. Should the Huns be defeated now, the other nations that Rome had subjugated for years would remember their grudges and could launch a unified attack with the Goths to end the Roman Empire. So the Huns had to remain on life support for now. But the problem was, Attila on life support was like a wounded Saiyan recovering after a great battle. You get me, bruv?
I do not understand.
I do. I understood that reference.
And if you don't get that reference, when Saiyans almost die in battle, they always come back stronger. Less than a year later, Attila returned to Western Rome to avenge his loss and immediately razed 1 or 3 cities to the ground. In fact, this time he plundered and raided and murdered and enslaved so hard that there was such a wave of refugees fleeing these lands that they literally went on to build a whole new city protected by water so that the Huns and their horses couldn't get to them. A city we now know as Venice, aka the house that Attila built. It seems that his loss to the Roman Avengers had made Attila worse than ever. He was on his endgame now, and Rome had nothing left to counter him with. In fact, Attila's revenge tour was so dominant that he even had time to make some stops, to relax, party, and get married. Not to Honoria. That was just another useful tool at the time to get into the Romans' heads and claim legitimacy and tool to attack them. No, now he got married for real. Attila married Ildiko in early 453, and the man, he enjoyed himself on his wedding day, because how could he not? He came back from certain death, he was stronger than ever, had Rome on its knees, and was about to marry a beautiful young woman. Attila must have been like, "I'm the king of the world!" And then he popped a blood vessel, got internal bleeding, choked on his own blood, and died. Yeah, and that's how quick the mighty fall. Thank you for watching. There is, of course, some confusion over Attila's death. Was it really just a popped blood vessel? Was it internal bleeding caused by years of excessive drinking? Was it a poisoned drink at his wedding? Was he assassinated? We will never really know, but what we do know is that his people all cut their long hair and slashed their cheeks in honor of their great leader and to signify that they are not mourning him with the tears and wailing of women, but with the blood of man. And while that sounds really cool, really tough, and if this were a movie, this would definitely set up some epic sequel of the Huns Strike Back. Epic. The reality is that without Attila, the Hunnic Empire crumbled. His sons and those who believed to be his heirs, or carry his spirit, or were just close to him, everybody started fighting over succession, the lands, over the right to titles. The Hunnic Empire lost focus and it fell apart over the following years. After Attila's death, the Huns rapidly became less and less of a threat to Rome. And yet, still, I argue that despite not being there to witness its demise, it was Attila who ultimately was the one to defeat Rome. Sure, it was other tribes that later actually invaded Roman lands and sacked the city brick by brick, took it apart, but it was Attila and the Huns that upset the balance of power in these lands and imposed a refugee crisis on Rome that was so taxing and sent so many tribes running westwards that it led to Rome literally imploding. Attila orchestrated Rome's downfall. He just wasn't around to actually see the empire crumble in the end. Instead, Attila was put to rest in an unknown riverbed, buried alongside iron and silver, buried in secret for all that buried him, took their own lives to allow their great leader to forever rest in peace. Such was their devotion.